In March 1987, a refugee arrived on the shores of Plymouth in southwest England. Despite having never set foot on British soil before, he was already something of a celebrity, and a crowd were gathered there to see him arrive, supporters eager to welcome him, and journalists ready to capture it all on film. It was a far warmer welcome than is typical for a migrant arriving in the UK, but that's because this refugee's story was also atypical, which you'd probably expect given that he was a donkey. Wait, what? If this story is going to make any sense, then we need to dial back time a bit, but I also need to give you a little bit of context. Here in the UK, we have what's known as silly season. Essentially, it's a period in summer when there isn't generally much news, and so media outlets, especially tabloids, start sharing stories that are a little more light-hearted and, well, silly. The phrase has been in use since the 19th century, and most silly season news stories are soon forgotten as people move on. But some have a bigger impact than others, and some, like this one, have such an impact that they end up saving lives. What started as a one-off silly season story led to international investigations, underhand journalism, decades of campaigning, and more than a little controversy. But let's start with the article that kicked all of this off. The first ones to cover this story in silly season of 1987 was tabloid The Sunday Express, when they published a story with the headline, "Poor El Condonado waits for his fat killer." Yeah, tabloids really can't go more than 5 seconds without saying something messed up, but putting the fat phobia to one side, because I absolutely don't have the energy to get into that today, the article detailed an annual festival held in the small Spanish town of Villanueva de Oliveira. Known as the Pero Palo Festival and held on Shrove Tuesday, the festival goes back to the Middle Ages and commemorates the execution of a rapist. The offender, who was apparently named Pero Palo, was dragged through the town and lynched. For whatever reason, it became a yearly tradition to reenact his punishment, with the role of Pero Palo being taken by a fabric dummy, not dissimilar to a Guy Fawkes effigy here in the UK, although this one is beaten to pieces and torn apart, rather than being burnt. The only part of it that survives is the wooden head, which is reused year after year. That part of the tradition is maybe a little weird, but ultimately harmless. The controversy we're talking about today surrounded an earlier part of the festival, when someone assumes the role of the town crier to ride through the town letting everyone know that the execution is about to take place. The man chosen to play the town crier is apparently always the largest and heaviest man in the village, and to perform his duties he sits on the back of a donkey that is far too small to bear that kind of weight. Alcohol consumption is a very big part of this festival, and so usually by the time the donkey's brought in, not only is the man who's supposed to ride him off his face, but so is most of the audience. The town has a population of about 2,000 people, and just about every single one of them turns out to celebrate the Pero Palo festival, following the town crier and leaving the narrow streets so tightly packed with bodies that it essentially forms a solid wall of humans. The audience are loud and often abusive towards the donkey, dragging it around, beating it, and forcing it to keep going even when it collapses with exhaustion. It's a painful and terrifying experience for the poor animal, who is forced to endure this mental and physical torture for at least an hour, but sometimes longer. It was said that the donkey used in 1986, the year before this fiasco, was abused and forced to keep going until it was killed. Elizabeth Svensson, the founder of the charity The Donkey Sanctuary, and her family had campaigned for years to put an end to the ritual cruelty, but without success. But it was through her work that the Sunday Express found out about it and decided to run an article about it, highlighting the plight of the donkey who had been chosen as that year's mount. The donkey was named after the Spanish word for black, since that's the colour he was. However, while this is just the name of a colour in Spanish, in English it's a word with a very racist history, and so the media over here decided to anglicise his name to Blackie, which arguably could still be seen as a bit questionable, but it does have a history of being used as an animal name with no racial connotations, and it's a hell of a lot better than the previous one. If you listened to my episode on the Tamworth 2, you'll know that if there was one thing the British tabloids used to love, it was finding an animal in need and turning its rescue mission into a publicity stunt / cash grab, and that was exactly the case with Blackie too. It's a shame that since then, British tabloids have just switched entirely to peddling hatred, bigotry, and other far-right awfulness. I mean, they still did some of that back then, don't get me wrong, but at least they'd occasionally do something that didn't actively make the world a worse and more dangerous place. Although neither of them were the first ones to break the story, tabloids The Daily Star and The Sun immediately scrambled to get their own journalists over to Spain to try and save Blackie's life. Hugh Whitto, the journalist from The Sun, seemed to snatch up victory almost immediately when he managed to track down the farmer who owned Blackie and offered to purchase him for somewhere in the region of £200. He then reported his victory to The Sun and retired for the night to a local hotel. And so, the very next morning, The Sun proudly printed the headline, "We saved Blackie!" Their victory would be short-lived though, because that very same day, the Star published an article titled "Gotcha," in which they proclaimed that they had been the ones to rescue the donkey. Because they were. You see, after Whitto had purchased Blackie, he'd also paid the farmer to keep him overnight, presumably because he didn't know where else to put him. But who should rock up at the farm that evening but the Star's reporter Don McKay? He also approached the farmer and offered to buy Blackie, and the farmer said yes. His ownership hadn't been legally transferred to the Sun yet, so as far as the farmer was concerned, he had no reason to refuse. After all, why wouldn't he want to get paid twice for the same animal? And as soon as McKay had his hands on Blackie, he was sure to smuggle him away so that he couldn't be sold for a third time. Pretty embarrassing for the Sun, who ended up offering thousands of pounds to the Star in exchange for getting him back, but to no avail. When it became clear to the Sun that they were going to have to give up on claiming the glory for rescuing Blackie, they instead resorted to some good old-fashioned mudflinging. The Star were open about their plans to have Blackie shipped over to the UK to live out the rest of his days in a sanctuary, so despite the fact that they had probably been planning that exact same thing had they been more fortunate, the Sun began running headlines arguing that such a journey would be detrimental for Blackie, launching a full campaign to try and scupper the Star's plans and turn the public against them. No one was convinced. One of the people who was most instrumental in getting Blackie shipped back to England was an animal rights activist named Vicky Moore. She was an incredible person who dedicated her life to saving animals in need. She founded the charity Fight Against Animal Cruelty in Europe, or FACE for short, and also carried out undercover investigations exposing abusive industries. But tragically, Vicky's dedication to the cause would ultimately cost her her life. In June 1995, as part of an ongoing investigation, she attended a Running of the Bulls event to capture video evidence of the torment the bulls suffer, and while she was doing so, there was a freak accident which resulted in her being gored and thrown into the air multiple times by one of the bulls. Miraculously, she survived, though she had to undergo a 7-hour surgery and spend nearly 6 weeks in intensive care. Rather than letting that deter her from her activism, though, Vicky continued working to save animals as soon as she was able to. Sadly, though, she never fully recovered from her injuries and passed away in February 2000, shortly after her 54th birthday. I fully intend to do a full episode on Vicky at some point in the future, because I just think she's incredible. She gave her life to save animals, and yet I never hear her mentioned in the animal advocacy community, so I wanted to do my part to share her story and keep her legacy going. After Vicky passed away, her husband Tony Moore took over the running of her charity FACE, and dedicated the rest of his life to continuing her work of trying to create a better, safer world for animals. In 2013, Tony lost his battle with lung cancer, passing away at the age of 79. The website for FACE is still up, and I will of course have it linked in the show notes. However, unfortunately it seems that it hasn't been updated at all since Tony died, and it doesn't seem that they're active as an organisation anymore, which is a real shame because they were doing such important work. Obviously, I'll be going into all of that in more detail when I do my dedicated Vicky Moore episode, so for now, let's return to Blackie. Despite the Sun's protestations, Blackie was successfully shipped over to England, arriving in Plymouth to an adoring crowd of supporters, who had eagerly been following his story in the papers. From Plymouth, Blackie then travelled the length of Devon until he reached the donkey sanctuary in Sidmouth, which would become his forever home. His name was officially lengthened to Blackie Star to honour the tabloid who rescued him. I can only imagine how much the Sun must have seethed at that. And for the next 5 years he lived a happy, peaceful life, receiving the care and pampering he deserved until he passed away in 1993. The donkey sanctuary was founded by a woman named Elizabeth Svensson, and is now run by her son Paul. Like his mother before him, Paul Svensson has dedicated his life to the welfare of donkeys, including continuing to campaign against the Pero festival. They also went on to create the first dedicated donkey sanctuary in Spain to continue helping animals in need. In 2004, Paul Svensson announced his plans to sue the mayor of Villanueva de la Vera because of the ongoing abuse of donkeys at the town's festival. Despite the amount of negative press they'd received during Blackie's rescue, nothing had really changed. There was growing pressure from animal welfare groups both in Spain and beyond, but officials were determined to continue on with the festival and the cruelty it involved, arguing that it was okay because it was tradition. And this justification was reflected in Spain's animal welfare laws, which included exemptions specifically for events that held intangible cultural heritage, like the Pero festival, bullfighting and bull runs. However, a new law was passed in 2003 that allowed individuals to take private legal action against anyone who was causing physical or mental cruelty to animals. And there's no doubt that the Pero donkeys were being subjected to that. Unfortunately, the only thing I could find about Paul's legal plans were from a single article where he announced his intentions, so as far as I can tell, it never actually went anywhere. I'm assuming that so-called cultural events were still considered to be exempt. But Paul and his sanctuary continued to campaign against the festival for at least the next 14 years. In 2009, a petition against the event gained over 7,500 signatures, but the officials from Villanueva de la Vera remained resolute in their refusal to give in to animal welfare campaigners. A year or two after the petition, a new president was elected for Extremadura, the region of Spain the town is in. This new president appeared to have a more sympathetic view towards the issue of animal rights than his predecessor, so there were hopes that he might be more willing to take action and enforce the animal welfare legislation that was already in place. But apparently that didn't happen because the fiesta continued to use donkeys. And besides, Villanueva de la Vera's city council made it clear that they would refuse to comply with any attempts to ban or change their use of donkeys at Pero, and the vast majority of residents echoed that sentiment. Teams from the donkey sanctuary would continue to attend the fiesta each year to try and compile evidence of the ongoing cruelty, though their efforts were hampered by local residents who would threaten them and try to stop them from filming and photographing the event. In 2009, they were able to prove that the vehicle being used to take the donkey to and from the festival didn't conform to Spain's legal requirements for animal transport, but from what I can tell, that too didn't lead to anything. In 2017, a vet from the sanctuary managed to get a blood sample from that year's donkey, during or immediately after the event, which showed massively increased levels of cortisol, the stress hormone, undeniable proof of the negative effect it was having on the animal, but again, nothing was done. And it's not as if Spain doesn't have laws against animal cruelty. If this kind of stuff had been happening in any other context, then there probably would have been some kind of justice. But like I said earlier, there are specific exemptions made for things that are considered tradition, and the Pero festival fell under that umbrella, meaning they could essentially do whatever they wanted to whichever donkey was unfortunate enough to be chosen that year, without having to face any kind of consequences. I've seen claims that sometimes the donkey would even be assaulted by members of the crowd with fireworks and sharp objects, although I can't verify that as 100% true, so take it with a grain of salt. In 2018, the victim was a donkey named Burnaby. He was ridden around the packed streets for over an hour, pushed and pulled about by a drunk and deafening crowd, and all the while being expected to carry the weight of a man far too heavy to be riding him. The Donkey Sanctuary and their Spanish sister charity, El Refugio del Burrito, continued trying to campaign against it and to raise awareness of what was going on, but seemingly to no avail. The most recent account of the Pero festival I could find was the one from 2018, detailing Burnaby's ordeal. There doesn't seem to be any mention of the campaign on the Donkey Sanctuary's website anymore either. I can't say for sure what the situation is these days, but I think if animal rights campaigners had managed to get the village to stop using donkeys, then there'd probably be online content celebrating their victory, so I have to assume the event is still going on. Maybe those campaigning against it realised they were never going to change the minds of those involved and moved on to other things, and the locals of Villanueva de la Vera have gotten better at avoiding unwelcome media coverage. I don't know. I really tried to find something more recent to end this episode on, and maybe there was something that I just missed. I can't pretend I'm an expert researcher, but unfortunately that's all I have about the current state of things. It's hardly the most satisfactory ending I can give you, but maybe the silence is a good thing. Maybe things have changed. We can hope. One thing I will say is that it doesn't seem that there has been a single case of a donkey being killed at the festival since the year before Blackie's rescue, so that's something, I guess. The journalist responsible for saving Blackie, Don McKay, would go on to become a successful war correspondent for the Daily Mail, covering such horrors as the Rwandan genocide, the First Gulf War, and the Bosnian War. Despite that, though, he would always be best known for his role in rescuing a little Spanish donkey. When he passed away from blood cancer in 2017, his obituaries mostly focused on his role in the Blackie saga rather than his other achievements. And the thing is, he knew that was probably going to be the case, and he didn't want it to be. For him, the proudest moment of his career was his pivotal role in saving the life of a British citizen named Mirza Tahir Hussain from death row in a Pakistani prison. McKay travelled undercover to the country to interview Hussain as part of a campaign to get him freed, and McKay's wife, writer and actress Nicola McAuliffe, immortalised the story in a play called A British Subject, which she wrote and starred in herself. Before his passing, Don McKay spoke about how he was concerned that all he'd be remembered for was the time he helped save a donkey, and not the time he helped save a human. So despite the fact that this episode is about Blackie's story, I still wanted to include some of McKay's other successes, because while what he did for Blackie was amazing, I agree that he deserves to be remembered for his other achievements too. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of the Animal Nerd podcast. I really hope you enjoyed it. If you did, then it would mean the world to me if you could support the show in any way that you can, whether that's through leaving us a review or rating in your podcast player of choice, sharing the show with a friend, or liking the video and leaving a comment if you're listening via YouTube. Any money made through this podcast goes to Animal Sanctuary The Little Rescue Zoo, so just by listening to and supporting the show, you're helping to make the world a better place for animals in need. Links to all of the sources used for this episode will be found in the show notes, as will links to the websites for the Donkey Sanctuary, El Refugio del Burrito, and the fight against animal cruelty in Europe, in case you'd like to support any of the non-profits featured in this story. You should also be able to find the Animal Nerd podcast's email address, website, and social media handles in there too. Thank you again so much for listening, and I'll see you in the next one. Stay wild, friends!